Today, the United States is the wealthiest and most powerful nation on Earth. But rewind a few centuries, and the land that eventually became this global superpower was almost entirely ignored. Following Columbus's initial voyage, early European powers were obsessed with two things: finding efficient trade routes to Asia and extracting gold from South America. Spain and Portugal divided up the globe to monopolize these assets, leaving North America completely off their radar. It took roughly another century before the British seriously arrived. While the French began quietly claiming the middle of the continent, English settlers established colonies along the east coast. Over the next 100 years, a steady stream of arrivals built up a dense population clinging to the Atlantic shoreline. For generations, these coastal settlements remained a distant, unremarkable fringe on the edge of a much larger European chessboard. That dynamic cracked in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. The British colonies defeated the French, but Great Britain had drained its treasury to do it. To recoup the costs, London imposed heavy taxes on the American settlers. The resulting backlash escalated from tax disputes to an armed rebellion, culminating in a 1776 Declaration of Independence. 5 years of grinding war later, the Americans won their freedom. But victory brought a massive new problem. Their government was an immediate disaster. The 13 colonies were operating as separate, disjointed nations, united in name only, and the entire project was fracturing. Facing total collapse, the states drafted a new constitution. This document forged a federal framework capable of binding the fractured states together under the executive leadership of George Washington. This centralized structure saved the infant nation from disintegrating, but stability bred extreme growth. The American population was doubling nearly every 20 years, and those sprawling families needed room to move. This map shows the early United States boxed in by a geographic barrier, the Mississippi River. Everything west of it belonged to France. American settlers relied on that river to move their goods, and leadership in Washington grew paranoid about what French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte might do if he decided to close the choke point. American diplomat fled to Paris, hoping to secure access to New Orleans, and found Napoleon desperate to fund his looming wars in Europe. Instead of haggling over a single port, the United States bought the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. In a single signature, the country doubled its size. This triggered an era of opportunistic expansion. In 1819, the U.S. bought Florida from a struggling Spanish empire. A couple of decades later, Americans who had settled in the Mexican territory of Texas rebelled, formed an independent republic, and were annexed by the administration of President James K. Polk. Pushing the borders of Texas south immediately provoked a war with Mexico. The U.S. won, paid $15 million to claim the entire northern half of Mexico, and simultaneously signed a treaty with Great Britain to lock down the Oregon Territory to the north. Right as the ink was drying on the borders of California, settlers discovered gold. Hundreds of thousands of people rushed into the rugged western frontier, carving out mines and farms to build an economy on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. In just 50 years, through a mix of luck, cash deals, and raw military force, America had sprinted from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But swallowing this much land quickly fractured the nation's internal politics. The core fracture was slavery. The northern states had outlawed the practice, while the southern agrarian economy was built on the labor of enslaved people. Every time a new western territory was added to the map, a vicious political battle erupted over whether that land would be free or enslaved. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln pushed that argument past the breaking point. Fearing the federal government would abolish slavery, southern states seceded to form their own republic, plunging the United States into a massive, industrialized civil war. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died in the conflict. Ultimately, the industrialized North crushed the rebellion, millions of enslaved people were emancipated, and the fractured states were permanently welded back into a single power. Immediately after this internal conflict, the U.S. resumed its expansion. Secretary of State William H. Seward noticed the Russian Empire was strapped for cash and purchased the massive territory of Alaska for $7.2 million. At the same time, American businessmen had effectively seized control of the Hawaiian Islands and asked Washington to annex them. While politicians debated the morality of the move, military strategists argued that if the U.S. didn't secure Hawaii, a rival empire like Germany or Japan would use it as a Pacific base. The Civil War burned away the fragmented alliances of the early republic, forging a centralized federal state that immediately turned its gaze toward the oceans. The real test of this outward ambition arrived in Cuba, where local revolutionaries were fighting a war for independence against Spain. American newspapers heavily publicized the conflict, and when an American warship mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, the United States told Spain to leave the island or face the consequences. Spain refused and declared war. In response, U.S. troops rapidly dismantled what remained of the Spanish Empire. The Americans seized control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, effectively replacing ancient Spanish colonies with outposts of a brand new American empire. Shortly after the war, Theodore Roosevelt unexpectedly became president. Energetic and ambitious, Roosevelt used his new colonies to project American influence globally, building up one of the largest naval fleets on Earth to do it. A two-ocean navy required a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific. When Colombia refused to allow a canal through its territory, Roosevelt backed a local independence movement. Panama was born, the dirt was moved, and the U.S. secured an exclusive, vital shipping lane. By the time the massive locks of the Panama Canal opened in 1914, American warships could move seamlessly between oceans. The United States now possessed the industrial capacity, the territory, and the military hardware to enforce its will on a global scale, right as World War I began. This rise to global supremacy was a ruthless 150-year sprint of opportunistic deals and strategic conquests that permanently redrew the map of the world.